Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. In just a minute, we're going to be talking about this new book, The Dying Citizen. You might remember the conversation we had just over a week ago in our weekend edition, where we were talking about one of the essays that came out early before the book about America and the dying citizen. And now we're going to be able to focus on the book for about an hour today. And then we're going to get back in the second hour into some of the issues of the economy. Some people raising questions about how good this jobs report is going to be. Some even saying, like, for example, Jack Dorsey, that maybe we're headed for hyperinflation. We'll try to analyze some of that. Also, the attempt to try to dodge the Constitution for a global tax. That comes from Janet Yellen. And at least some good news. A few governors saying, well, if the federal government's not going to address issues ranging from immigration to supply chain, governors in places like Texas and Florida and other places are going to try to solve the problem on their own. So we have a lot to cover, and we'll do so. But we are privileged to bring to the microphone Victor Davis Hanson, individual we quote quite often here on the program, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, graduate of Stanford University, then went on to actually establish the classics program there at Cal State University, Fresno, where he now is the emeritus professor from that. Also serves sometimes as the visiting fellow in history at Hillsdale College, and the author of this new book, The Dying Citizen: How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. Victor Davis Hanson, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
I went through our list the other day. Obviously, it's been a while since we've had you on this program, but we quote you frequently, and I did a little search on the Point of View website. I think I got 90 hits. Now, again, some of those might be duplicates, because sometimes when we post one of your articles, sometimes the next week I do a commentary on them. But if nothing else, we are looking forward to the conversation as we talk about peasants and residents and tribes and the unelected evolutionaries and globalists. But I thought we might begin by the essay that came out about 2 weeks ago, which is actually the introduction in your book. And that is that when we look around the world, 7 billion people, only about half live in what you might call consensual governments. And as a result, even more disturbing from that article, only 22 of those particular governments of republics and democracies have been in existence for a half century. So we grow up here thinking that everyone has a constitution, everyone has freedom, and then every once in a while news reminds us that is not the case. But I think it shows us, Dr. Hanson, really how fragile this republic could be.
It is. It's the exception in history's rule, both from the very ancient and recent past, and then currently. Most people find it too burdensome to elect their own officials, to keep them honest, to audit them, to censor them, to ensure that they have secure borders, and that's their own responsibility. And they outsource that time and effort either to sort of a totalitarian left-wing government, or a dictator, or a right-wing fascist. But the idea that you're going to be consensual, constitutional, Republican, Democratic governments, it's very fragile. It takes too much out of citizens, apparently. And most of the great philosophers of the West have lamented that fact, and sometimes did more than lament it. They sort of welcomed it. So this idea that we can, outsource a lot of our own responsibilities to a permanent administrative state, or not have secure borders where we have nowhere to honor and cherish and reiterate customs and traditions and the Constitution, or we're going to revert to a tribalism where we identify by our superficial appearance. That's not the abnormality. That's the normality of his civilization, why it's been so brutal and poor. And this, I think people who are very critical of this country should take a deep breath and say, you better be careful of sowing internal dissension and attacking institutions that have been around for 233 years, because there's not much better, and there's usually much worse in the past. And when you look around the world today, find a place where you'd rather be. And there's very few, if any, of them.
That's very true. And again, the book, I might just mention, 400 pages, about 60 pages of endnotes, just great material there. One section on the pre-citizens, that's the peasants, residents, and tribes. Second one on post-citizens. And of course, that's chapter 4 on the unelected, that bureaucratic state. And because you live in California, we have always enjoyed as well reading some of your commentary about how that has changed, because I grew up in California, and some of my co-hosts, when we've had roundtable discussions, have as well, but it's a different kind of California, very different than when, for example, my father ran for the California Assembly and eventually then even elected Ronald Reagan, because you have, as you put it, kind of a coastal elite, and then, of course, the rest of California, especially in the Central Valley and places where you live, that look a little bit more like a third world country. And I'm reading you more and more, in which, for example, you wrote one the other day about the Afghanistanization of America, in which you said, if this trend continues, we really will look like a third world country, won't we?
Yeah, I think it's already happening. It's accelerated. It's kind of frightening how fast it's accelerated since January, because I think it's no exaggeration to say that we don't have a border nationally anymore. It disappeared. It doesn't exist in the South, at least. We've had 2 million people who are scheduled to cross in this fiscal year, and I think we're going to get 3 million. We have no idea who they are. We're very strenuous about a vaccination mandate for U.S. citizens, but not apparently for foreign residents who enter the country illegally. And then because of this new critical legal theory, or these district attorneys who will not prosecute felonies, or they feel that society is culpable for the criminal acts of the individual, we've lost deterrence in our major cities. So when you go into San Francisco, and I was just in Seattle this weekend, or you go to Los Angeles, I was there last week, or Portland, or Minneapolis, these cities, not to mention, I was in New York 3 weeks ago, they're starting to resemble Baltimore or Detroit or Chicago. In other words, it's not safe to go out at night. And I think that's because the criminal has made a risk-to-benefit analysis and feels that the chances of being held accountable for crimes are much less than the lucre that might result, or the sick fascination with hurting somebody. And so that's a sign of civilizational collapse when you can't go into a major city after dark. You don't have a border. I don't think you or I or any of your listeners ever imagined that we would be sort of Venezuela, like Venezuela. And I don't know how you make a verb out of that, Venezuelaized. But the point is, if you fly over Los Angeles, you see these cargo ships stacked out to the horizon. And you start to see Target and Walmart, and there's vast areas of the shelf that are empty. And this is not even getting into what I think most of us also feel, that the inflation rate is not 5 to 7% when we look at the price of cars, or housing, or rent, or food, or lumber, or a dryer or a washer. They've gone up 10 to 15 to 20%.
That's right. Just don't say treadmill, because you get in trouble if you say treadmill. But we need to take one of these breaks, and we'll come back and talk about that, because that's one of the first chapters on just the idea of a self-governing citizen that should be economically autonomous. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Candidate Joe Biden assured us that in order to pay for all the government spending he proposed, he would only tax the rich. He promised not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 per year. Most of us knew that that was not true, but if you still have any doubts, you only need to look at the latest proposal to have the IRS and banks spy on you. I'm talking about the requirement for banks to report any transaction of $600 or more. If the government were only going after wealthy Americans, you would think that the minimum level would be $1,000 or $5,000. The $600 threshold was certainly a wake-up call for middle-class Americans. They realized lots of their bank transactions could now come under the scrutiny of the IRS. Few Americans are tax cheats, but most Americans aren't thrilled about providing such confidential information to the government and wondering what government bureaucrats might do with it. The justification for this intrusion is to close the tax gap and pay for an additional $3.5 trillion in government spending. But we'll never be able to close the gap between taxation and government spending. Consider this thought experiment. News outlets now estimate that Elon Musk is the richest American with an estimated wealth of $200 billion. Imagine he knew he was dying and decided to cash in all of his wealth and donate all the proceeds to the U.S. government to pay down the national debt. His generous contribution would only cover 0.007% of that debt. Even if all 600 billionaires did the same, it would hardly reduce the national debt in any significant way. These proposed regulations prove to anyone willing to look at them that everyone will pay, not just a few billionaires and millionaires. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My guest today, Victor Davis Hanson, as we talk about the new book, The Dying Citizen, came out earlier this month, and you perhaps will be able to find it in your local bookstore. I was in 2 bookstores this weekend. I don't remember seeing it, but that doesn't mean anything because, it is just coming out. But even if not, we have a link so that you can get it in hardback or Kindle, and I would encourage you to find out a little bit more. First of all, Dr. Hanson, when we talk about peasants, let me hasten to say we're not saying that we're necessarily in a feudal system yet, but there is a sense in which, as you talk about in that chapter, that we're getting more and more of a class system. Your governor there in the state of California says the rules apply to you, but doesn't necessarily apply to me. The Speaker of the House sort of says the same kind of thing, but it's more than that. It's the economic issues that we've talked about on this program before: debt, wages, inflation. Matter of fact, a good portion of what we're going to talk about after we let you go in less than an hour will be that topic, because I have come to conclude that we need to spend more time talking about what's happening in the economy because it affects so many of our listeners.
Absolutely. In California, but in the nation at large, until 2017, middle-class wages had been static or declined. And in addition, credit card aggregate debt was way up. Most people die, half the country dies with less than $10,000 in net worth. We have $1.7 trillion in collective student debt, largely because the federal government guaranteed student loans, and then these universities, some with huge endowments that are non-taxable, raised the rate of tuition above the rate of inflation. So they became fabulously expensive because the moral hazard was that there was no downside for students borrowing a lot of money in their way because they could default and not be punished by the federal government, and the federal government would still supply a revenue stream to universities. But all of this had an aggregate toll. So if you're a young person and you look at the key things of a civilization, what the conservative or traditional influences that keep it going generation to generation, it's very alarming. We have the age of marriage has gone from 23 to 26. It's now about 29. Childbearing has gone, the first child has gone from 29 to about 33. And the average family has shrunk just 20 years ago from 2.1 to 2.2 down to 1.7. The average age that a person buys their first home, not only is the percentage of people able to do that now down again to it's getting near only 60%, but the age in which they can do so is going up into the late 30s and early 40s. And you put all that together, it kind of creates a prolonged adolescence where people of the middle class are simply not, young people are not graduating from college without debt, with definable skills, broadly educated, impressing employers, getting married, having children, buying homes, all the conservative influences that separate someone from being once fixated on themselves and their appetites to caring about a mortgage, caring about a spouse, caring about a child. And so that's historically has been kind of the mark of decline in a society. And here in California, you ask, well, how did this happen? Well, the middle class itself has fled, to be honest. We had about 8 million people have left in the last 30 years to either no or low state taxes, income tax. We have a 13.3 top rate. We have about 11% sales tax. We have the highest gas taxes in the country. We have very high sales tax. And a lot of people say, you know what? If I'm going to pay all that, and then I have to do business, and I have the highest regulations, and my kids are in schools that are ranked 44 in the nation, or they have to drive on freeways and over bridges that are 50th in the 49th, I guess, like a little bit better than Mississippi, then what's the point of living here? And especially when you look at the crime, per capita crime rates in San Francisco or Los Angeles. So they have left, and then we allowed people to come across the border illegally the last 40 years, and we have a large number of people who, about 4 million, who are not legally residents of the United States, and their children that are, but we haven't fully assimilate them or integrate them in a way we used to do it in the past. And then we have about $5 trillion of market capitalization that flooded our thin coastal strip, mostly, Facebook, Google, Twitter, et cetera, Apple. And that you put all that together, and you've got a very wealthy coastal strip where the major international universities, Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, USC are, and then you've got an impoverished center, and then the middle class is leaving or has already left. So we are a medieval society, and it reflects this decline generally of the middle class. And I think if you look at a map, you can see it. You can see these blue strips from Boston maybe to Washington or Seattle to San Diego, and they're very thin, and they're about half the population, and they were the winners of globalization. They had skills that took advantage of a 7 billion person connected market, whether they were lawyers or financiers or corporate people or academics and media. And then we had the people in the middle that occupied 80% of the territory, but they too were 50% of the population. And their muscular labor could be outsourced offshore, Xerox. So these were people in assembly, manufacturing, small farming, timber, mining. And as we see from these things that are stacked up out in the port of Savannah or the port of LA, we're helpless now because we've said that we can't build things or that we don't want to pump oil. We're pumping almost 2.5 million barrels less than we were just under Donald Trump. So we're outsourcing the dirty, muscular, tough jobs that are essential to civilization. And we sort of glorified these coastal elites because they've made so much money and they're so successful. But it's really made a society of lower middle class people and very, very wealthy people. And the parties reflect that. The Democratic Party used to pride itself. It was a lunch bucket union party.
Working families.
And now, no, it's not. By any measure you want to use, zip codes, congressional districts, per capita income, counties, all of the bluest areas are also all the most affluent and the most poor.
Of course. And I just might mention that the booklet that we did a while back on America Realignment, of course, looks at that and got a picture of a U-Haul on the front, but also this issue of immigration, because this kind of bleeds into your next chapter, which talks about this idea of course, we've had the American experiment, and we've always had a time in which we have been a melting pot, but now we live in this borderless world, and I'm broadcasting today from Texas. You're in California, and I've traveled to many of the states where we do carry this program, and I point out that you may look at those of us in Arizona, New Mexico, California, Texas as border states, but now they're in your state as well. Every state's a border state, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I'm sitting here speaking to you in the center of California, and I'm about 300 miles from the border. And I can tell you that, and I'm about 1,000 miles where the border is now the most porous in Texas, maybe 1,500 miles. And I can tell you that in my community, that's about 90% first or second generation immigrants from Mexico, maybe many of them here illegally. We are already experiencing people who are coming into the Central Valley of California, and they didn't necessarily cross where they had traditionally crossed, but now there's a rebuilt wall. They're coming and being bused all over the country, and I think that's a deliberate policy on the part of Mr. Mayorkas and Joe Biden, that to dampen the effects of this absolutely wide open border, they're going to bus people in various areas. And I have a feeling, I'm not paranoid, but from initial reports, they are going to send people into congressional districts or areas where they feel that people dependent on the government for the next 10 or 15 years will reflect that field in politics, and in some areas it'll be advantageous to them, whether in the national or local or state election.
Let me just take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation. Been talking about a couple of the chapters. We'll get back to the issue maybe of tribes, because that's important. We have always assumed that if, in terms of immigration, that people might eventually sort of give up their primary identities. They never forget that they were Irish or Polish or whatever, but now that's changed dramatically. We've talked about that with Jonathan Haidt, actually the coddling of the American mind, and of course Senator Ben Sasse and others. We'll get into that. And then we'll get into this other whole section that is really important, the unelected. What about the bureaucracy and the road to serfdom? The evolutionaries, as we've talked about so often on Friday, when we certainly have some of our legal experts in here talking about the attempt to maybe just completely dismantle the Constitution and change all of the traditions of the Senate, whether it's the filibuster, whether it's the size of the Supreme Court or things of that nature. And before we're done, we'll talk about globalists. Of course, we've talked about the world is flat, but there are some really negative consequences to globalism and the globalists. So we have a lot more to cover, and we will continue our conversation with Victor Davis Hanson and his book, The Dying Citizen, right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, Victor Davis Hanson with us as we talk about his book, The Dying Citizen. And Dr. Hanson, one of the chapters, of course, is on tribes, and I do want to get into some of the issues of the bureaucracy and the rest. But when you talk about tribes, we always recognize that when somebody came here from Italy, okay, they call themselves an Italian American, but now we so emphasize ethnic, racial, and tribal divisions that, I'll just use one example from your book, Justice Sonia Sotomayor Jemiah, I think you said 38 times identified herself as Latin American or just a Latina, not even a Latin American or not even Hispanic American. And so we have so elevated the particular ethnic or religious values, primarily, of course, the racial values, to a point where it's really hard to have citizenship, isn't it?
It's impossible. And she not only referred to herself as Latina rather than Mexican American or Puerto Rican American or whatever background she wished to emphasize, but she said she was a wise Latina and brought superior judgment because she was not a white male. And it's not just that people are identifying in tribal fashion. That would be bad enough. But now they're suggesting that in repertory fashion, that the dominant culture, 70%, is somehow culpable for 233 years of what they feel has been a toxic experience. And so we're racializing almost everything. We're racializing vaccinations. We're racializing COVID. We're racializing admissions and hiring. And we're doing so in a way that was even different than affirmative action. Affirmative action was sort of a compensatory plan to address slavery and Jim Crow, where 11% or 12% of the population was given some help in admissions and hiring since about 1965. In other words, for the last, half century or more. But under Obama, there was a really deleterious development where we really started using this word diversity. And what we meant was all you had to have in common was you were not so-called white. Now, how you could tell that, I don't know, because many people in minorities are whiter than white. Then, you can be white and you can be a tan Italian American, and you can be non-white and you can have blonde hair and blue eyes and be from Spain but have a Spanish name. So it was very ridiculous in the beginning. You don't almost need DNA badges or old Confederacy 1/16 drop rules. But nevertheless, that sort of enlarged the people who said they were oppressed or victimized, and it really ignored entirely class. And class had been associated with race and said, people are not doing well because of racial discrimination, so let's help them across the spectrum. So all of a sudden you can be a Punjabi immigrant, be a millionaire, or you can come from Spain or Argentina, or you can be an orthodontist, a second generation, third generation orthodontist from South Korea. But the fact that you're now diverse means that you have claims against the majority, and it results, doesn't it, in some absurd things. Meghan Markle, from a $15 million mansion in Montecito, California, complaining to Oprah in her $90 million Montecito mansion about the hurts and afflictions and biases they've suffered. Or Barack Obama venturing out of his $20 million Martha's Vineyard estate to lecture the country on how illiberal it is. And so I think we got to just stop that, or if we don't, this very rare attempt to have a multiracial democracy won't work anymore. And it's not working in India very well, and it's not working in Brazil. And any time in history you had a multiracial nation, it required a degree of coercion, whether it was the Soviet Union or the Ottoman Empire, that's not compatible with American values. So ours was sort of, we're going to look at Martin Luther King's message, and that was going to be our national creed, that it's the content of our character and not the color of our skin. But when you start allowing students to pick the race of their future dorm mate in college, or you tell people there are going to be areas on campus where you cannot go depending on your race, or you're going to say that we're going to waive SAT points up to 150 or 250 points because of one's race, or subtract them from one race and add them to another, then you're getting back to, again, a pre-civilizational tribalism. And everybody will go tribal. If you feel that you're going out into a multiracial society and you're not in the proper tribe at the proper place at the proper time, then you will start to be gang-like. You'll start to say, well, I'm going to hang out with people that I look like. And what is the result of this is it destroys meritocracy. And you start hiring people on the basis, or you start associating people on the basis of blood tie. Are they my first cousin? Do they look like me? And that's never worked in history. Why we would do this in the 233rd year our republic is just crazy. I think it has something to do with the progressive message. The left-wing political message is not resonating with the people. These issues that they're advancing have no popular support. So they either want to change the demography or change the culture or, as we said earlier, change the system under which we operate, the evolutionaries.
I can't imagine anything more toxic to developing a unified country than tribalism. And so that is part of that whole section on pre-citizens. But in the time remaining, I wanted to talk about post-citizens. And one of those chapters is the unelected. And that is remarkable because when I, first of all, took classes in government and then later had a chance to teach some of those ideas, I found that we always were recognizing that the bureaucracy was big and had an influence. But now you see more and more pieces of legislation, Victor Davis Hanson, in which it will simply say, like it did say in the Affordable Care Act, the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine. And more questions are being moved from Congress to the unelected bureaucrats. And Friedrich Hayek warned us about that a long time ago, didn't he?
He did. And the larger that corpus of legislation that was not passed by elected representatives gets, the more arcane it is, the more Byzantine it becomes. And then the permanent state is the only people who know how to interpret it. And elected officials come and go, but they stay. And when you add 2 million of them now on the federal level and much more millions on the state and local, about 40% of us work in some fashion for a government agency, it gets kind of scary because you see they're combining now legislative, executive, and judicial power. In other words, they're judge, jury, and executioner. They can come out to your farm or business and say to you, that is an infraction. I see that as an infraction, and I have interpreted it as an infraction, even though maybe the legislator didn't mean it. But this is my interpretation of the IRS law or the EPA law or the workers' comp law, and therefore I find you in violation as a judge, and then I've already made the law up and I found you, and then I'm going to determine what you owe. If you don't like it, go hire a lawyer, but I have free legal representation as part of a government service. So, and then when you look at the people who are reigning over these agencies, and the conservative community should be very worried because I think we were all big supporters of the military, intelligence, investigatory agencies. But when you have the CIA, John Brennan, or Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, lying under oath, and admittedly lying under oath to Congress, or James Comey and Andrew McCabe lying under oath. McCabe admitted he lied under oath, and we know that James Comey said he couldn't remember 245 times under examination by Congress, and Robert Mueller, of course, said he had no idea what Fusion GPS and Steele dossier were, the two pillars of his investigation.
Incredible.
And you have, and then General Milley saying that, I told the President of the United States that Afghanistan would be in danger, and the President said, no, he did not tell me. And then he says, I characterized the President in violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice as a Nazi, and as, he said, I didn't say that. That was what Bob Woodward said I said. And then these are people who are not elected, and they're exercising degrees of power, and they're being duplicitous and untruthful, and they're not facing any circumstances, consequences. So all the people I've mentioned have had no problem with lying under oath, and they have admitted they lied. And Lois Lerner had no problem. And yet they do a lot of damage. People like Carter Page or Michael Flynn or other people who feel that they're not favored by the judicial system or the bureaucracy or whatever particular progressive group exercises power. They're on the other end of very asymmetrical treatment. So I think we really got to take a look as conservatives and say,
yes,
what in the world has the FBI been doing? What in the world is CIA? When James Clapper said, I gave the least untruthful answer under oath, why wasn't he cited for perjury? And if we don't do it, then we deserve what we get, because we've created sort of a Terminator that's taken a life of its own. It's turning on its creators.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll certainly spend a little bit more time trying to focus on a little bit more of the information that is in this very good book, The Dying Citizen. It is published by Basic Books. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but by now I suspect some of you would like to get a copy. We have a link available to you on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Victor Davis Hanson as we talk about his book, The Dying Citizen. By the way, if you'd like to connect up with him or read some of the other things that he has written, first of all, you can go to our website. We have a link to victorhanson.com, so you can find those there. Of course, just simply go to our website, pointofview.net. As I mentioned, do a search engine. It will fill up page after page, screen after screen of various articles over the years that we have posted, including information about this book. In case you don't find it in your local bookstore, I would encourage you to buy it there if you can, but if not, we have it available in hardback and Kindle. And Dr. Hanson, let's, if we can, maybe at least pick off one more chapter, and that's the evolutionaries. And I thought it was striking that the first quote you have in there is from Woodrow Wilson: "The Constitution was not made to fit us like a straitjacket." And, you know, if I were alive at the time, I'd say, Mr. President, yes, it was. Read Federalist Paper number 10, Federalist Paper number 51. This was an attempt to actually have just a few enumerated powers delegated to the federal government. The rest were reserved to the states and the people, and all the checks and balances were there to be a straitjacket. But today we have, as you say, evolutionaries that want to change the Constitution. They want to revise the Constitution. They want to increase the size of the Supreme Court. They want to change the Electoral College, and on and on and on. Of course, they want to get rid of the filibuster, and that's not good for the Republic in the future, is it?
No, there's a couple of themes to it, and that is they do believe that human nature changes, that's malleable, that with greater education or diet or technology, that the brain, our essence, changes, even though we know that great thinkers and history itself shows that it doesn't, that people are people across time and space. But they feel, therefore, that a bunch of old white men, as they label them, are irrelevant for a new type of person. And so they always want to evolve in a way that a trajectory they feel achieves greater equity or justice, of course, overseen by a few elites. And that's where they start from. And the second, more practical reason they're doing this is that, again, they're not able to pass an agenda through the consent of the governed. I mean, they do it through the bureaucracy, they do it by changing the demography, or they do it by changing voting laws or whatever. So in their exasperation, they think, as they're looking at America now, where all of our policies are unpopular, Joe Biden himself is no longer a counterweight to that. He's a force multiplier of that unpopularity. We've really got to get rid of the 180-year filibuster. It's just not fair. Even though Barack Obama was a great advocate of it when he was in the Senate. We've got to get rid of the 60-year tradition of 50 states and get 4 more senators from D.C. and Puerto Rico. We just got to ignore the Constitution and let the government federalize all election laws on a national level within each particular state, intrude into those states and do that. We've got to get rid of the 150-year tradition of 9 justices because they're not working out the way that we plan. And, you know, they used to love the electoral. I went back when I was researching for the book, and I just could not believe 2003, 2002, to 1990s especially, but even in 2008, 9, 10, they said, you know, the blue wall, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all of these states are going to go Democratic, and that's all we need because before an election starts, we've got California, Illinois, and New York, and that's enough electoral. And then suddenly in 2016, that vanished, and now they want to get rid of the 233-year-old tradition of electoral college without any argument or reference to the Federalist Papers or indeed the Constitution explaining why we have it and why that makes us so different than the messy parliamentary governments, you know, multiple tiny parties that you see in Europe at the time. So, and where is this coming from? It's coming not from the people. There's no popular demand for any of this. It's coming from the law schools. Yeah, it's coming from law school academics, professors, media, journalists, the top down. That's why I put them in sort of post-citizens, top down. And it leads in, I placed it so it would lead into the final chapter on globalism because these people want to harmonize not just the economy and fashion and culture on a global level, but they think they're very ashamed of our Constitution. They're ashamed of the Second Amendment. They're ashamed that Americans are the most suspicious of abortion of any people in the world. And they look at this tradition of that and they say, you know what? When I go to London or I go to Shanghai, or I just don't feel like I'm an international cosmopolitan, and we've got to, you know, call in the UN as Secretary of State Blinken just did, and see if we're racist. And you know, maybe Iran, maybe North Korea, maybe Communist China will be on that investigatory audit committee, but you know. Or Anthony Fauci just believes he's got to funnel $600,000 to the Wuhan Virology Lab and entrust our health policy to the World Health Organization. But it really filters down to a loss of sovereignty, and we could go on and on about the Iran deal or the Paris Climate Accord, but there's this bicoastal effort to subordinate our Constitution and our sovereignty to these global elites, this Davos crowd, and it's very dangerous.
Certainly is. And again, at least we've touched on each one of those 6 chapters. Such great material. And just since we only have a couple minutes left, I thought I just might mention when we're talking about globalist, we've been talking a lot about China lately because of a hypersonic missile that is nuclear tipped. And you're old enough and I'm old enough to remember when we used to have discussions around this table about, does it really make sense to make China part of the World Trade Organization? And the argument always was, and the argument I'm starting to hear again from Jen Psaki and from actually the Secretary of Commerce and others, is, well, if we just allow capitalism and bring them into the world, they'll be more like us. But I think you would probably agree, even though we wanted to make China more like us, I think China made us more like them, because I see a much more authoritarian world than existed just a few decades ago. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think you can see that throughout history. The British Empire was going to civilize the world, and then Dickens was writing at the very pinnacle of the empire about the filth and poverty in downtown London. And so when you dilute your values and you try to take on and encompass these global issues, you're going to be weakened at home. And what's really scary is if you just think of the people in the news, Hunter Biden, and his Chinese 10%, he owns a Chinese company, or General Milley contacting the head of the People's Liberation Army and saying that he would warn him about an aggressive act from an order from his own president.
Oh,
or you look
amazing.
at Anthony Fauci in the virology lab, or Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg. China is absolutely far more adept than the old Soviets were propaganda. Anytime you criticize them, you're called a racist or you're insensitive. And most of our elites, either financially or emotionally or intellectually, are deeply tied to Chinese counterparts.
Yes.
And it's insidious. It really is. It's scary.
Don't be an NBA athlete and say anything about China, Hong Kong, or anything like that. And certainly don't dare say anything like that on the establishment media. Well, we're simply out of time, but if nothing else, I wanted you, first of all, to know about the book. I had one of my roundtable discussion people saying, I actually want The Dying Citizen I'll put my Christmas list. I think he should get it before he waits till it arrives on December 25th. I think you should get a copy of it as well. And if you'd like to know more about this, we have information about the book. We also have a link to victorhanson.com, so you can find many of his other pieces and interviews. And Victor Davis Hanson, always a delight to have you on the program. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're going to take a break, and some of the things we've been talking about, we're going to be getting into the next hour. What's going on with the economy? What's going on with China? What's going on with the supply chain? There's some things that maybe some of the governors, like Governor Greg Abbott in Texas or Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, can do to maybe mitigate some of that. I think we have some answers there, too. So we have a lot to cover in the next hour. But first of all, I would encourage you to go to the website, find out about this book, find out about victorhanson.com, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic. I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let me just give you a program note. Tomorrow we're going to have Janet Parshall with us. We're going to talk about the state of the American church. We're going to kind of back and forth. I'm going to share some facts and figures. She has certainly quite a number, and so we'll get into that. Michael Rodelnik will be with us on Wednesday. We'll be talking about some of those verses in the Bible that we sometimes need to understand how to interpret. On Thursday, lots of guests, but one that I did want to highlight real quickly is Max McLean, because this new movie coming out called The Reluctant Convert on C.S. Lewis, very well done. And so we do want to, as always, feature something that I think you and your family would want to see and certainly could be very helpful. This hour, we're going to start off by talking about some of the economic issues and trying to give you a little bit of a look ahead as what I think will happen this week in terms of some of the economic news. And it used to be that we didn't always talk about these economic issues, but first of all, you can look at this booklet I'm holding up right now on debt, and we recognize that indebtedness is a big issue for Americans. Of course, my more recent one on money also addresses that, but we recognize that we're living in some kind of perilous times, uncertain times economically, and I think I would be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time talking about that. Then we're going to move on to, of course, one or two of the articles we've posted, Dodging the Constitution for a Global Tax, and that relates a little bit even to my commentary today, in which in order to even pay for this huge monstrosity, which we encourage you to take action on, by the way, if you haven't, we still have the take action item up there on the Build Back Better Act, although now that has actually passed on, so we'll probably modify it to talk about what's going on taking place in the Senate. And of course that leads to, of course, my commentary where they talked about the requirement for banks to report any transaction of $600 or more. I'll update that because in the Senate they're talking about, well, maybe we should make it easier and just make it $10,000 a year, which is essentially the same thing. It just reduces some of the paperwork burden of the banks, but we'll get into that. Also, a very good piece that came out by Joe Concha. Unanswered questions remain concerning Pete Buttigieg, and then I want to spend some time talking about what some of the governors are doing, what is called the anti-China left. It's kind of hard to understand, but basically people criticizing anytime you talk about China as being, well, that means you're racist, you don't like Chinese people. No, we every time have to issue that disclaimer because people are manipulating that so that you can't ever say anything negative about China. And before we're done, just a piece that just came out the other day on the coincidences that you'd have to believe in order to still believe that this virus did not come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and maybe put a smile on your face because you'd have to believe a lot of coincidences. But let's get into the economy, and this comes from Jim Garrity, who we've quoted before. He was just here in Dallas at the Library of Harlan Crow. The other day, Probe did, I should say Point of View did an event there. And what was so interesting is never been there before, and so that was kind of interesting. But one of the speakers is Kevin Hassett. We've quoted him before. And there is every reason to believe that when we get this report that will come out on Thursday, and we'll talk more about this on Friday, it's going to tell us that the gross domestic product in America has dropped significantly. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One of those is when you pay people not to work, what happens? People don't work. Also, I want to modify that because some of you might say, well, I live in a state now that no longer provides that $300 a week benefit. True. So I might also, for you, modify it. When you pay people not to work, people eventually get used to not working. And so there are other issues other than simply that. The supply chain is one of those issues. The number of people that are not working and thus producing things is another reason. But what we have right now is the possibility that this could be a really dismal report on what happened to the gross domestic product in the third quarter. And so Kevin Hassett suggests that even though people are projecting it's going to be at 2.8%, any economy that's less than 3% growth at a time when we're supposedly rebounding from the pandemic is not good. But he actually says he believes it's going to be a whole lot worse because there are people that look at various studies that have been done to try to track the GDP. Some think that it might only be 1.5%. Some think it could be as low as 0.5%. And so once you have what many people consider to be the world's largest economy not growing at all at a time when we supposedly are supposed to be rebounding from the pandemic, tells you a lot of what's going on. But then many people are saying, if you thought the third quarter up until September is bad enough, wait till you get to the end of December. Of course, that won't come out in January. They think that will be even worse. Unless you have any doubts about that, you have, for example, the National Association of Wholesale Distributors, which is a very significant trade group that represents about 6 million workers. They've been trying to plead with the Biden administration, please delay this December 8th deadline in which people have to be vaccinated. One of the individuals said, look, if tens or hundreds of thousands of employees are terminated just 2 weeks before Christmas, well, boy, that's going to be a great Christmas present. The result could be nothing short of catastrophic for the newly unemployed and their families and for the economy. So that is the case. And, of course, you also had a statement the other day from the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. Supply constraints and elevated inflation are likely to last longer than previously expected and well into the next year, and the same is true for pressures on wages. So those are just a couple of points, but just before we take a break, let me take one of the pieces of bad news that I think may be overstated, and that is, you might remember the name Jack Dorsey. He is one of the co-founders of Twitter. Of course, he's been interviewed on how Twitter sometimes suppresses certain kinds of tweets, including one from the former president of the United States. But he posted something over the weekend that got a lot of people's attention. Hyperinflation is going to change everything. It's happening. Okay, hyperinflation, the textbook definition is hyperinflation happens when you have an increase of 50% of prices in a year. That is pretty amazing. I mean, we recognize that the so-called 5% is probably too low. Maybe 10% is closer. But again, he's saying, somebody said, well, you mean like what they have in Nigeria? Nigeria right now has officially 16% inflation. He says it will happen in the United States soon, and so for the world. I'm not sure I buy that, but it is interesting that you have somebody who might have access to more data than we have around this table saying that hyperinflation is on the horizon. Let's certainly pray and hope not. But that's at least a statement from somebody who might actually have more numbers and figures than we do. And it brings us to, of course, some other conversation we're going to have in just a minute about the supply chain and how that has really had such a negative impact, not only on the economy, interesting enough, even on the environment. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Candidate Joe Biden assured us that in order to pay for all the government spending he proposed, he would only tax the rich. He promised not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 per year. Most of us knew that that was not true, but if you still have any doubts, you only need to look at the latest proposal to have the IRS and banks spy on you. I'm talking about the requirement for banks to report any transaction of $600 or more. If the government were only going after wealthy Americans, you would think that the minimum level would be $1,000 or $5,000. The $600 threshold was certainly a wake-up call for middle-class Americans. They realized lots of their bank transactions could now come under the scrutiny of the IRS. Few Americans are tax cheats, but most Americans aren't thrilled about providing such confidential information to the government and wondering what government bureaucrats might do with it. The justification for this intrusion is to close the tax gap and pay for an additional $3.5 trillion in government spending. But we'll never be able to close the gap between taxation and government spending. Consider this thought experiment. News outlets now estimate that Elon Musk is the richest American with an estimated wealth of $200 billion. Imagine he knew he was dying and decided to cash in all of his wealth and donate all the proceeds to the U.S. government to pay down the national debt. His generous contribution would only cover 0.007% of that debt. Even if all 600 billionaires did the same, it would hardly reduce the national debt in any significant way. These proposed regulations prove to anyone willing to look at them that everyone will pay, not just a few billionaires and millionaires. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, going to talk about the economy and then supply chain. And if you'd like to join us, love to know what's going on in your community. As we were just talking about with Victor Davis Hanson, you can go into some stores and see empty shelves. Used to be we saw empty shelves of ammunition because of supply chain issues, but now empty shelves of basic staples and government because of government policies, which we're going to talk about in just a minute in terms of some of the things that the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, should be working on and much more. But again, I did just a minute ago express a little bit of skepticism, which I think is natural and certainly responsible when Jack Dorsey says hyperinflation is going to change everything and it's on the horizon. Maybe it is, but when he's saying that on the horizon, I tend to be thinking he means in the next month or so, and I don't deny that if we don't change some things pretty quickly, that could happen. And of course, inflation is theoretically at 5.4%. Does anybody seriously believe that? I appreciate the fact that Victor Davis Hanson saying the same things those of us around the table have said, and that is probably closer to 10%, using the kind of metric that we used to use a couple of decades ago that has been changed dramatically. The only thing that would actually create hyperinflation would be, I don't know, if you dumped a billion and then another billion and then eventually a couple $1 trillion into the economy all at once. Well, that could be the Build Back Better bill that we've encouraged you to contact your member of Congress about, or maybe another $1 trillion from the infrastructure bill. Now, again, when they spend theoretically $3.5 trillion, that's over a period of time. But if even billions of that up to $1 trillion dumped in at once, you could see that might have an impact. But I'm a little skeptical, but I could be wrong, and let's hope that I am. Actually, let's hope that I'm not wrong, because we don't want to be dealing with the kind of hyperinflation that we've seen in places like Venezuela, all the way back to Nazi Germany and the rest. But let's get to the supply chain, because that's another issue, and that is, this is something I did not know, because we have very tightly straining supply chain systems. This has now become a real target for hackers. I did not even think about that. It allows them to really lock things up even more so. The other day, of course, Microsoft talked about one of these hackers using what's called the SolarWinds cyber attack, and I won't go into all the details, but there are a couple of which you've had, in some cases, Russian hackers, sometimes entrepreneurial hackers that have been taking on things that have really constrained the supply chain. So again, if you think it's bad now, we saw, of course, what happened with pipelines and a number of other things. It could get worse in the future. But then we also have the other aspect of that, which I'd never thought about, and that is, not only does the supply chain issue affect the economy, it also affects the environment. How so? Well, it turns out, as Jim Garrity points out, what happens when you leave lots of cargo ships sitting out off the coast of ports or going around in circles while waiting for a slot to happen? A lot more accidents. And so what you've had is probably now a record number of those shipping containers have now fallen overboard from ships primarily in the Pacific Ocean. And that has been the first thing. Then you had a couple of other issues, because you had one of the oil spills off of their Southern California. Those of you in California are probably paying more attention to this than some of our listeners in other states, in which they think one of these container ships dragged an anchor over a pipeline, and that then eventually kind of creased it, and eventually the pipeline gave out, and so we have the oil spill. So we have containers in the Pacific Ocean, we have oil spills, and all of that due to, of course, the supply chain issue, which brings me to the Joe Concha piece that is in The Hill. The Hill, if you're not familiar, is kind of the organ that reports on what happens on Capitol Hill and on government. And so this is looking at some of these unanswered questions that need to be answered by the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg. And he says, for example, the crisis could end up being the domestic story of the year because supply chain problems are affecting every American. Let me talk about that for a minute, because sometimes when we talk about these issues on Point of View, I remember for years we talked about healthcare issues, oftentimes with Dr. Merrill Matthews or a variety of members of Congress, and everybody just sort of listened attentively as best they could, but it really didn't necessarily generate a lot of phone calls until we all of a sudden had the issue of Obamacare, as I mentioned before, called the Affordable Care Act, and now it affected your particular life. And so whereas before healthcare debate, healthcare policy was kind of theoretical, a little bit abstract, all of a sudden it was affecting your day-to-day life. Again, when we talk about supply chain issues, it seems pretty hypothetical, pretty abstract, until you go to the grocery store and you can't find something that you need to feed your family with, or you go to the department store or the big box store and you need some information, you need some various kind of services, you need some various kinds of equipment, and there's nobody there to answer your question because they're not working anymore. There's no equipment there for you to use because it's stuck on a cargo ship out there off of Long Beach or Los Angeles. And so as a result, you can see that as inventories, as this article says, decline, prices continue to rise when core inflation is already at a 30-year high. Of course, you have Jack Dorsey saying it's going to be a lot higher. So, Joe Concha says there are some questions the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, should answer. How many ports have you visited? How many port operators and trucking executives have you met in person? And who served as acting director during your extended paternity leave? Well, the answers to the first two questions are none and none. This is the Secretary of Transportation. I mean, it's bad enough that we have a situation in which the vice president, who is supposedly given responsibility to actually address the border, she, as far as we could tell, for a very long period of time, never went to the border, eventually did out of pressure. And here you have the Secretary of Transportation that is, tell me this isn't true, has never actually been to one of those ports and has never had a conversation with any of those port operators. This comes from, again, individual that probably would know, Joe Concha. And I just thought this article, which we've posted on the website, might be something that you would like to look at the area in the future. And so then you, of course, have the whole question about these shortages. And this got me thinking about how long this is going to last, because even if we could then get all of these container ships unloaded, we have also another shortage, truck drivers. And again, those of you that are truck drivers right now, tell us a story. Give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, because according to the most recent estimates, and I have no reason to disagree with these, given the shortage of truck drivers, there's about 13 loads of container ships for every truck at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So again, that suggests that when you are talking about how long will we get back to normal, well, 6 months, forget that. Maybe 18 months, that might not be enough. When you start having people talk about 2023, well, that's 14 months from now. So anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. And then the answer from the administration, Ron Klein, who's, of course, chief of staff for Joe Biden, actually reposted a piece in which they said these economic problems we're facing right now are high-class problems. High-class problems. And I love what Joe Concha says. So that means only rich people drive cars and purchase gasoline, the price of which is up a whopping 42% compared to last year. You mean only rich people buy groceries with prices for meat and eggs and fish and poultry up 10% compared to last year, beef and veal up 17%. You can see how these lines that keep getting used are hard for the average American to accept. And like I said, talk about supply chain, a lot of people's eyes glaze over. They go into one of their favorite stores and they can't buy one of the products they wanted to buy. They can't buy a piece of equipment they want to buy, and they have trouble finding anybody to help them because they don't have enough people actually there stocking the stores and actually helping you out. You can see we've got some real problems, not the least of which is the most recent Quinnipiac poll in this article. Joe Biden is actually polling at 28% among independents. 28%. So I'd love to get your comments. We have some more to cover. And of course, we're going to talk about dodging the Constitution. We're talking about what some of the governors are trying to do to deal with some of those issues. So we'll certainly do that. But we'll take your phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. Be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear from some of you truck drivers, because we're starting to see that even if we can solve the supply chain issue in terms of those container ships out there sitting around and just moored and waiting to eventually be unloaded, we got the second issue, and that is, do we have enough truck drivers? That's something we talked about before. And again, this is a very significant issue that needs to be addressed. And sleep well, America. The Secretary of Transportation apparently hasn't talked to anybody at any of these ports. Maybe since that was published, that will shame him into going and doing his job. But nevertheless, that's the world we live in. So I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Let's get to a couple of issues. Congress, of course, looking at whether or not it should actually encourage people in the IRS to investigate you, because if you spend $600 or more on a transaction, then that should be reported to the IRS. And so that's part of what is called the Build Back Better Act, which we encourage you to contact your member of Congress about. But here is the latest that has come down, and that is the Senate Democrats have recognized, this $600 limit, that's kind of a non-starter. Maybe that's a little too controversial. So they're proposing instead that the IRS report on individual accounts of $10,000. Well, that's making a distinction without a difference. All it simply does is say it's still going to affect almost everybody in America, but it won't affect banks as much, because then they just annually have to report that. And of course, we're, by the way, also told and assured that this would not increase the audit rates for Americans making less than $400,000. I don't believe that. You shouldn't believe it either. Because really, if your goal is to catch tax cheats, which is kind of the issue, then wealthy are going to find ways to underreport. And so the only way to catch them is to sweep you and millions of other Americans up into the IRS net. So that is certainly the case. So anyway, my commentary today starts with the number that has been used in the House version and still in the versions that will be voted on, but still could be changed. And that's the $600 transaction. And that threshold, I think, is another wake-up call for middle-class America, because I think a lot of you, as I said, don't really pay attention to health care. Instead, all of a sudden, this is going to affect my expenses on health care, as the Affordable Care Act did. Sometimes you don't pay a lot of attention to supply chain issues until I go to my store and can't find what I wanted to buy. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, I don't really care if they go after some of those people that make $400,000 a year, because it doesn't affect me. All of a sudden, when they talk about $600, people say, wait a minute, that affects me. So I think all of a sudden this is awoken, if that's a word, the sleeping giant in the electorate, and we will see where that takes us. And I do want to get to some of the phone calls, because as I mentioned just a minute ago, I want to hear from some of those of you that drive a truck. But just before we do so, let me just mention my first article, and I'll go through it very quickly before I start taking some phone calls, is Dodging the Constitution for a Global Tax. And that is, of course, there has been an attempt to try to figure out a way to increase taxes on corporations. That may not happen, but one of the ways in which Janet Yellen, who is now the Secretary of Treasury, who of course head of the Federal Reserve, was to actually go and try to get other countries to actually establish a minimum global tax, so that we wouldn't look so out of kilter with the rest of these countries. So one is a pillar to determine how governments are going to tax revenues. The second one is to have a minimum global tax. The trouble with the first one is that there are bilateral and multilateral tax treaties specifically telling the government how to address this issue of corporate taxation. And so in order for this to actually be implemented constitutionally, it would have to pass the Senate. That means you'd have to get 67 senators to support the tax plan as a treaty, and that's never going to happen. So now they're talking about, well, maybe we'll just put it under, you wait for it, reconciliation. We've talked about this before, so that you could only have to get 50 votes, Democrats, theoretically, and the vice president to actually pass this. So here you now have the Secretary of Treasury trying to figure out a way to pass a treaty that's not a treaty by actually circumventing the Constitution. It's something that, again, we will probably talk about on Friday, but I wanted to mention it today so that some of you would be aware of the fact that this is another one of these constitutional issues, very different than the ones mentioned by Victor Davis Hanson, but very similar to many of the others he mentions in his book. Well, let's take some phone calls, and I did want to hear from a few of you that are truck drivers, so let's, if we can, I'm having a little difficulty. Can somebody put Mark line 1 on there? Because there we go. Mark, thank you for joining us today. I understand you're a truck driver.
Yes, sir.
So what would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, the port has been a mess for a long time, but they're slow, take forever to get in and out. Now we have a real major problem going on out there. And cost fuel and sitting out there with a computer logbook, you work 14-hour clock. And if you're driving or not, it's ticked. You can only drive 11 hours.
Right. I don't know how you guys do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you can't do it if you're sitting at a port for 12 hours.
You got it.
You're going to run out of hours, and you're still stuck there. You end up spending a lot of time sitting there, and you're not getting paid for it. And you're idling your truck. You're spending right now about $2,000 a week to fill the thing up. And just ain't no money in the ports. I got a little local job now. I quit doing ports. And I get paid $18 after an hour after I sit 45 minutes. I get paid by the load. I just drive like 40 miles, and I get paid $50. And, I come out better. I'm home every night. Drivers are leaving the ports because there just ain't no money. They get a local job and be home every night and come out better.
Good point. And again, you can see why there would be individuals that would not want to go to the port. Mark, by the way, is in South Carolina, and again, that's a little different. But again, those of you that listen in California, and there are ports up and down the coast all the way to the inland part, there's Stockton, for example, and others. And that is indeed a real question. If I have to sit there all day while they eventually load me up, and then I can only drive so much. I mean, it's just, the economics just don't work. And so that's the case. Let's take our second call here, and that's Forrest. Thank you for joining us today.
Good day, Kirby. May you be blessed.
Well, thank you for joining us. I think you want to talk about the $600 limit there on the IRS. What would you like to say?
Well, unfortunately, for those on the lower pay scales that try to do, jockey lots, flea markets, things of that nature, as long as it's under $600, it does not have to be reported to the IRS. But once you hit $600, technically you're supposed to fill out a 1099, and a lot of people don't bother filling out a 1099 if they make like $800 or something like that.
I understand.
And they're looking for a little chump change that all the little blue-collar workers are trying to make on the side to survive, and I do believe that is what is happening with their $600. They're wanting all of our little guys' money as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, as I said before, and if you have the commentary today, I would encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. Scroll down on the left-hand side. It is entitled, Everyone Will Pay, because, as I said, if you're only trying to go after the make the rich pay their fair share argument, which, again, I always have to roll my eyes a little bit because that doesn't necessarily fit, because I point out that if you even were to take all of Elon Musk's money, it would cover 0.007% of the national debt. So even the wealthiest, richest American wouldn't be able to deal with that. But again, if your real goal was to go after wealthy Americans, wouldn't you set the minimum level at $1,000 or $5,000? When they set it at $600, it was just, I think, a wake-up call for a lot of us that all of us, if indeed this piece of legislation passes and is implemented, all of us will come under scrutiny from the IRS. And I don't think most Americans are tax cheats, but that's not the issue. You're just not thrilled about providing all that confidential information to the government and then wondering what the government bureaucrats will do with that, because you give to a particular organization and then activists find that out and then they use that to get you fired from your job or something of that nature. I think people would like to have a little more privacy. Privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is just saying, you know, there are a lot of mean people in the world and they can do a lot with the information that might be provided by a government bureaucrat, intentionally or accidentally, whether through hacking or deliberate actions. Anyway, let's take a break. A lot more to cover. We'll do it right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just, if I can, for a few minutes, give you a little bit of encouragement. And that is, I hear so often, and whether I'm in Alaska or California, certainly South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, all the places we've been this year, meeting with some of you that are listeners. And if I haven't made it to your state, you hold on, we'll get there. But one of the questions I get all the time is, okay, we recognize that this administration doesn't want to address some of these issues. Isn't there something governors can do? So I'm going to give you two examples. There are others, but I just, in the interest of time, I'll give you two. What about what's going on in the southern border? Well, again, the governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott, has implemented what's called Operation Lone Star. And this has been very successful so far. They've had more than 7,000 illegal immigrants that have been arrested by Texas state agencies because they have been able to tell the various individuals, DPS, that would be Department of Public Safety individuals, that these troopers are allowed to obviously enforce the law, and that is to enforce any federal or state criminal laws. So that could range from criminal trespass to smuggling to human trafficking, and because then they're actually under the jurisdiction of the state of Texas, then you don't run into the situation where they're just immediately released by the federal authorities. So this has been a good example in which if individuals commit a crime, and that could range from trespassing to drug possession, then those individuals, if they were picked up by the federal government, the Biden administration would simply charge them and then tell them to come back for a very, if you will, some kind of court date. And most of the time they're just released into the interior of the U.S. and they never come back. As I've said jokingly before, I like to fly fish. Catch and release is great for fly fishing. Catch and release is terrible for border security. So you say, well, isn't there something the governor can do? Well, there's one governor that says, yeah, we can do something. Let's deal with the topic at hand just a minute ago that we mentioned, and that is the issue of the supply chain. As you might know, I suspect most of you have heard now, that the governor of the state of Florida, that would be Ron DeSantis, in a speech actually urged the ships that are backed up outside of California ports to make the trip through the Panama Canal to Florida, where the ports are open and ready to unload goods. Matter of fact, he said, year after year, we continue to invest in our seaports, in infrastructure, and in workforce education, make sure our supply chain is resilient. And that was a speech he gave at the Jacksonville Port Complex. Now, let's just be honest enough to say that if you're sitting on a container ship right now outside of Long Beach or Los Angeles, then, well, it's quite possible that you might think about making that trip, but it's doubtful. Let's face it, they will just sit there long enough to hopefully unload. But the question is how long it will be unloaded from that particular port. But the issue of making the statement is, just imagine if you're a container ship leaving, say, China, the Philippines, Japan, wherever, towards the United States, you might think that instead of heading kind of north to California, you might stay closer to the equator and then intentionally go through the Panama Canal and go to that particular unloading dock in Florida. Of course, you'd have to change the ship's manifest, a number of other things, but at least is a possibility. So sometimes the argument and the question that comes out is, either the argument is, can't we do something about it? Or the question is, of course, what can we do? In either case, I want to give you a couple of very good examples of individuals that indeed have stepped forward as governors to say, well, if the federal government can't deal with the problem, maybe we can deal with the problem. And I think we need more of that out-of-the-box kind of thinking if we're going to get through this latest rough patch that obviously we're all experiencing. Last article, real quickly, and it will be real quick, is one that Jimmy Quinn wrote, in which he points out that there is what you could call the anti-China left. Okay, it's hard to get your head around it, but he says when the House Republicans proposed sanctions against China, and this would be targeted against the Chinese Communist Party, that was stonewalled actually in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And then the statement was issued by the chairman, that'd be Gregory Meeks, that the broad generalities contained in this amendment leave such sanctions open to significant politicization and ambiguity. And what he's pointing out here is a lot of these more left-wing Asian American advocacy groups actually spurred by pandemic-era hate crimes, because there have been some. We've talked about that. And teaming up with anti-war activist groups have now basically just said that anytime you want to actually issue sanctions against Communist China, or even if you speak out against the Communist Party in China, that will always be simply labeled as being anti-Asian. And as he points out, by conflating anti-China policies with anti-Asian racism, progressive groups have actually been able to create this new narrative, which has allowed individuals then to be supportive of China without actually having to deal with the issue at hand. And if people aren't really thinking about this, and you've heard me so many times on this program when we start talking about what's going on in China, to actually say, now again, my criticism is about the Chinese Communist Party, not of the Chinese people. The reason I say it is because then, of course, there are always the emails and comments coming in, well, you hate Chinese people, which is ridiculous. But again, it's been used as a very effective weapon against what is happening in China right now and what will continue to happen in the future. And this is a 5-page article, but let me just read one more quote. Interestingly enough, from him, he says reasonable anti-China policies are obviously distinct from the vile anti-Asian sentiments that sometimes have surfaced because of the virus and people blaming Chinese people for a Chinese virus and all the rest. But he says the two expose a fundamental misunderstanding of the Chinese Communist Party, and as a result are certainly some things that need to be addressed. So I wanted to post this because I am seeing this personally, more and more of what you call the anti-China left, in which anytime you make a criticism of China or the Chinese Communist Party, that is then immediately conflated with being anti-Chinese or anti-Asian, and that's not the case. I'll leave for maybe tomorrow a look at the coincidences that would have to actually all come together in order for you to still believe that this virus did not come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but probably came from the wet market. Matter of fact, I might even do a commentary on it, because if I've counted correctly, there is at least 9 different coincidences that would all have to take place for you to still hold to that theory, which I think strains any kind of credibility. An example I always love to use is, if somebody wins the state lottery in your state, you go, well, that's not surprising. Somebody probably is going to win, at least occasionally. If that same person won again, then you'd start saying, well, that coincidence is a little too hard to accept, especially if then you find out that person won with the same set of numbers that he or she won with before. At that point, the coincidences are too high to simply dismiss as something that just was a probability that actually came due. And that's kind of what's going on now, with more and more evidence coming in every day with the Wuhan virus, or the virus from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But we'll cover that in another day. Don't forget, Janet Parsh will be with us tomorrow, and all the articles we're talking about today are on the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew as our engineer. Steve is our producer. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.